Greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young. And it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now. I'm Karen Christensen, and I'm delighted to be talking this morning once again with Carl Rollyson. Today we're talking about a different poet, Sylvia Plath, whose story, as I've been preparing for this podcast, Carl, seems as convoluted. Even after her death, the story of the story is convoluted, and that's what I'm hoping you can elucidate for us. You're definitely the person to do that.
Sure. Yeah, it's people say, why has there been, so many books on Sylvia Plath? I mean, there are a lot of answers to that. I think she is a great poet, for one thing.
Uh-huh.
There's the whole second wave feminism interest in finding great women authors and so on. But in Plath's case, I mean, I've just published my 5th book on Plath, and someone must think I'm a maniac to do that.
I won't say that, but perhaps something along those lines.
Will, yeah. Even a biographer once said, another book. So, I mean, even biographers don't understand. Part of the reason is because her archive was so messed up. And when she died, for instance, the first reports implied that it was a natural death, that she hadn't taken her own life. So there was
let's step back. For the listeners who have perhaps only heard her name, could you give us a little snapshot of who she was, and then we can go into the later complications that you have.
Yeah. She was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1932, and her father was a college professor. Her mother at one point was actually a student of her father's. They got married. Plath had a younger brother, Warren, 2 years younger. She grew up, people may be surprised to learn, if they know anything about Sylvia Plath, they think, oh, she was a suicide, sad life. She grew up, her father died when she was 8. I have done 2 books on her diaries, and her early childhood diaries, there's no indication of trauma. And she writes about everything. She writes about her boyfriend. She writes about her mother. She writes about what's happening at school. She writes about her activities and so on. And there's nothing there. She's not a loner at school. She's not disturbed in that sense at all. She's very jolly. She's got a great stamp collection. She's got girlfriends by every measure. And she's writing about this by the age of 11, just like John Quincy Adams begins his diary at the age of 11, too, both from Massachusetts. And I consider Plath, I say this in an article part of a book that will be coming out, that Plath is one of the founders. She's one of the founders. In her elementary school, she wrote about all kinds of things in American history, the American Revolution and the Almaty Plan of Union. Who even knows what that is? That's Benjamin Franklin's 1757 idea that the colonies, guess what? He thinks the colonies should unite. And everyone says, no, we don't want to do that. Less than 20 years later, they're doing that. Anyway, she's very bright. She wins lots of prizes.
Yes.
Her first poem is published when she's 8 years old. She has a sense of the world right off the bat. I mean, her father, even though her father dies when she's 8, he talks to her like an adult. And there are a few childhood letters and poems that she addresses to him and so on. She's in wealthy Massachusetts. She's in a wealthy area. Her family is not wealthy, but her mother scrimped and saved and thought probably Plath would, when she got to college age, would get a town scholarship. I'm sure Plath could have, because Plath just excelled.
Yeah.
But Plath got it into her mind she wanted to go away from home. She wanted to go to Smith College, and that's crucial, not just because it's Smith, but because Sylvia Plath wanted to leave home.
Yeah.
She has this engagement with the world. She doesn't want to be cosseted. She doesn't want to be pampered. She wants to be challenged. She wants to be at Smith a journalist. She wants to report on when various important public figures come to campus, including Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe
Hmm.
McCarthy. She wants to know about all of that. I emphasize that because, again, there is a people know about Plath at all. They think of her as this wounded, sad, self-absorbed
Hmm.
creature. And although
Hmm.
you can certainly, like many artists, she's certainly self-absorbed, huge ego,
Yeah. And
wants to,
ambition.
yeah, is huge ambition. And that's part of why she gets upset in a sense. She gets depressed from time to time. I'm hesitant to diagnose her,
Hmm.
but she did say about herself that she was manic depressive. So I'm not,
Hmm.
I'm not applying something to her. It was something that she was very aware of. One of the things she loved to read about was abnormal psychology, for example.
Hmm.
Anyway, she does very well at Smith, wins more awards, wants to go abroad, and she even says in her
Hmm.
journal, I got to do this. She doesn't say she's scared, but she sort of says, this is going to be a real challenge for me to go abroad. She wants to go to Oxford or Cambridge. It turns out to be Cambridge, and it turns out that she also gets a Fulbright. She's a Fulbrighter at Smith College. And to make a long, long story short, she really thrives at Cambridge, becomes a member of a dramatic society, for instance, does some
And that was a
stage
time when a
roles.
lot of women would get married straight out of college.
Yeah, and that's what women of her generation, the Smith College generation,
Yeah.
did
So
generally. They
she
got married.
instead.
Yeah, and her diaries are full of
Mm.
she did want to get married. She did want to have children. She was very much a part of her time in that sense,
Mhm.
but she kept saying, but I got to find the right guy because, she dates this doctor, Dick, he's going to be a doctor, Dick Norton. And she says, I think he's going to want me to be kind of a conventional wife. And I don't think that's not for me.
Mhm.
So she doesn't know when this is going to happen. She's worried about going into her 20s when she's going to get married. And then she meets this just incredible guy. Many people described him as a kind of Heathcliff figure.
Mhm.
Dark looks, there's a mystique about
And the
him, Ted
Yorkshire
Hughes,
accent.
the Yorkshire accent, it's like he emerges right out of Wuthering Heights,
Yeah.
you know. He's handsome.
Scary
Platt
stuff though.
thinks, yeah, he's kind of scary. He already has a girlfriend, but then he meets Plath, and not even a year goes by and they're married. And she's already saying, I am going to be the poetess of America, and he's going to be the poet of England. And, she was prophetic. I mean, he did eventually become the poet laureate
Yes.
of England and a good, good friend of the prince, who's now Charles III. So she had this really heady kind of experience. And like you mentioned the word ambition, it's one of the things I identify with Plath. If you're an ambitious person, it doesn't matter how well you do, if you're a writer,
Mhm.
how many
Mhm.
books you publish, it's always the next book,
Yes.
something that's going to be even greater than what you've known before.
What drew you to her? I mean,
A number
your
of yeah,
first books was what,
yeah, a number of
2013?
yeah, 2013, yeah, 50th anniversary of her
Mm.
death. That book arose in part because it suddenly dawned on me that it was going to be the 50th anniversary of
Mhm.
her death. And I had started teaching her. This is, like around 2012 2011, I started thinking about doing a biography of her, knowing that this anniversary was coming up and knowing that publishers love anniversaries. They just love it as a promotional marketing sort of thing. So that was part of it. But I had been teaching Plath since the 1970s. I had taught her in high school. And long before I had any sort of personal connection with her, I wasn't writing biographies then. I didn't start writing biographies till the mid 1980s. But two of her poems, one called Mirror and the other one called Metaphors, were in an anthology called Sound and Sense by Lawrence Perrin. And I taught these poems to students, and they're just remarkable poems. They're great poems. And so I was a great admirer of her work right from the get-go. But the more I learned about her, and once I moved to New York in 1987, I met one of Plath's biographers, Paul Alexander, who wrote a fine biography of Plath. Once I began to look at her, her father died when she was 8, and my father died when I was 13. Now, I'm older than an 8-year-old, but many of the same feelings about having to get things done, that every moment counts. There's an awareness, an understanding of mortality that I think Plath had and that I have, and that this always happens with me when I do a biography of someone. There's something about that person that I connect with, and that even if there have been many other books about their biographies of that person, I feel, and it may just be an illusion, but that's okay. I have to pursue it because I think I know something about this person that hasn't quite come out in the discussion or the books about that person. So there's all that. There's my experience in England, very much the same as hers at an even younger age. She had just finished her undergraduate degree in England when she went at Smith College when she went to England. I was 15 years old in 1963 on a theater tour in England performing Shakespeare. And so that's the year she dies.
Yes.
She dies, I arrive. I didn't know in 1963 when I arrived there that Sylvia Plath was there.
What month did you arrive, Carl?
It would have been in the summer. It would have been
I see. So it had
in
warmed up
June.
because
So it had
that's
been
one of the
about 6
things.
months that it warmed up. It wasn't that terrible. I didn't know anything about that terrible winter.
That terrible winter. Yeah.
No, but what I did know, and what might surprise people, depending on your age and your experience, England in 1963 was still recovering from World War II. London was not, it was a metropolis. It was a city. It was, in many ways, you might say it was thriving, but it had especially when you got outside of London, when you went to Yorkshire, as I did, and you saw those old woolen mills, and you saw Manchester, and you saw those kind of grim buildings, relics of the Industrial Revolution. And I stayed, for instance, in a dormitory at University of Leeds that did not have central heating, had a little heater built into the wall. So that when Plath talks about the lack of central heating, people might think, oh, well, come on. No, if you've grown up with central heating and then you have to cope with, places that aren't heated centrally, and you're an American like me or like Sylvia Plath, it does something to you. It gets into your bones.
And Americans, when I lived in England in the 70s, and we did have central heating, but Americans would come and they would say, I am so cold all the time, because they'd say, like, even people from the Midwest, they'd say, the cold here is different.
It's I don't
damper.
know if it's actually different, but to an American, the perception is there.
Yeah, very. And it was cold, and the English are used to having places cold, but that winter when she died, I feel when I read about that and imagine the ice on the windows and just the impossibility of getting really warm, and people didn't have dryers, so it was hard to get your clothes dry. There was this
Yeah,
just dampness, a cold dampness about things.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. She she comes to England. It's 55, 56, her first initial period in England, and she's already talking about, how cold it is,
Mm.
and trying to adjust to it. And she has certain remarkable passages in her journals about what the cold feels like. And it
Oh.
it
Mhm.
approaches the feeling that you get in Game of Thrones when those ice people arrive. It's like that. She personifies the cold. In other words, the cold is it's not just gee, I'm cold. It's cold is her nemesis.
Mhm. Mhm.
It infects her. And the other thing you need to know about Sylvia Plath is that she was a worshiper of the sun.
Mm.
She
Mhm.
her books and her journals and diaries are filled with her talking about, I got a really good burn today. She didn't worry about sunburns. And her mother, by the time she was 1, 2 years old, every afternoon would set her child out in the sun.
Mhm.
It was almost a kind of religion.
Mhm.
And then to be in England
Where it's not
without
just cold, but dark.
cold and dark, and they don't have those huge, expansive, sandy beaches that
Yeah.
she absolutely loved.
So,
She would
Cole,
talk
what
about.
what was she doing there? Why did she stay?
She stayed because couple of reasons. She thought after she met Ted Hughes, one of the what she thought was a great development was she got a teaching job at Smith. One of her old teachers arranged things so that she could go and teach, and they were very happy about that. Hughes had never been to America, and Plath thought, well, he'll just like he romanced me, he'll romance the rest of the country.
Mhm.
And he wins a huge award, a Harper's Award for his first book of poetry, and everything just looks so great. And one of the mysteries of her life, actually, and biographers don't
Mhm.
talk about it very much, and I'm not sure why. I think it's really significant. They go to America, and it turns out teaching isn't for her. It isn't for her because she finds it exhausting, and it doesn't give her enough time to concentrate on her own work, her
Mhm.
poetry and prose. And her fellow colleagues say in the English department, well, you got the summers. But she wanted to be at it all the time. And she found, say, like teaching D.H. Lawrence, she loved T.H. Lawrence,
Uh,
and teaching was good, but I want to be the next T.H. Lawrence. I don't want to just write about it or read about him or even just
yeah.
write about him.
Yeah.
I want to be Lawrence or like Lawrence. So teaching becomes a burden. And at the same time, Hughes is, when you read his letters, this is what she doesn't talk about. He absolutely detests America.
Mhm.
He thinks America is wrapped in cellophane. America's artificial. All this cheeriness and optimism and what does he like about it? The only thing he likes about Northampton is it's got some streets that look like English streets.
Mhm.
That's what he likes. And he's just unlike, say, Vladimir Nabokov, and you can think of
Mhm.
many other Englishmen and Europeans who come to America, and
And
it's a
quite like,
deliverance.
yeah.
They
Yeah.
quite like it. It's
Yeah.
expansive. That's what they like. He hates it. He absolutely hates it. And what
What is
they
he
decide,
doing? What is he doing when they're in Northampton? Is he
well,
teaching his
that's the problem. What he's doing there is sulking.
huh.
He talks about his time in America as he says, I've got a stretch in America, like you're in a
Mhm.
jail cell, you're
Oh.
doing a sentence. He says to his instructors, my stretch is about a year. He does get a job teaching, and he's actually a pretty good teacher, but it's
Mhm.
it's kind of like what I say about teaching. The only thing that I'd like better about teaching is not teaching. And that's kind of how he felt about teaching. The problem was he almost never suffered from anything like writer's block.
Uh-huh.
and he had it in the United States. It just wasn't his place. And, Hughes, Plath thought that Hughes would get acclimated to America just like she could get acclimated to
Yeah.
England. It happens. There are lots of examples of it, but it didn't happen. And what she actually says about their moving back to England in 1960 is, we can make a living there. And it's true, as poets, which you just couldn't do in the
Mm-hmm.
United States. This still wasn't a time when,
Because
yes, she was teaching. Yeah,
they did radio shows and things like
they
that,
did.
didn't
See, the
they?
BBC really
Mm-hmm.
funded a lot of writers,
Yeah.
and you could make a living. And he wasn't, he didn't punch a clock. He didn't go into the BBC every day, but he did programs on poetry, on his own poetry,
Mm-hmm.
reading other people's poetry, all kinds of things, and then there were various events and so on. And they were able to cobble together a living as writers. And both of them thought, and I think it was true, they couldn't do that in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't happen. The only way they could do it would be both of them to go into teaching, and they just did not want to do
Right,
that.
which is a very different life. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, hmm. So we have these two young poets, but he is much better known in those,
Yes.
right? I mean, the dynamic between them. Can you tell us what that?
Yeah.
And we're talking about a period. She killed herself in February of 1963. So we're talking
That's
about
right.
quite a short period
Quite
of
a
time
short period.
in
Yeah, about
which
6 years together. Yeah.
they moved, they had a couple kids, they moved across the Atlantic, they moved around. So I mean, this is it's quite a turbulent short period. But
Yes,
in the
it is.
meantime, you have these two ambitious writers. So what was going on there?
Well, it was remarkable, and it worked for quite a long time. I mean, 6 years doesn't seem like a long time, but it was to them in a sense. What happened was, yes, he was better known. He won the first award. His books were published before hers were. She was getting published in, journals like Poetry and eventually The New Yorker. I mean, very important
Mhm.
publications. She had trouble getting her first book published, which didn't happen until 1960, several years into the marriage. But it worked, and the reason it worked is for a couple of reasons. She thought, not just being a good wife, but being an artist, she thought that his work was better than hers. Ultimately, I think it got reversed. Her work was better than his. But to begin with, it wasn't. And she didn't think it was. At the same time, he was very attentive. He didn't just go off and write his stuff. He would say in his letters, I did this, and, Sylvia made it so much better. In other words, she was an excellent critic of his own work. And of course, he also criticized her work and helped her. So they really felt they had formed this kind of bond.
Uh-huh.
And Plath was, even in her most private journals, sometimes it was a problem in the sense that he was getting so much attention. Unlike him, she did not sulk. She sometimes got depressed, but she was depressed about her own productivity, about whether she was performing at a high enough level. So that was always a concern for her. The other really interesting thing, and that I try to bring out in my last book, The Making of Sylvia Plath, is she went to a therapist. And she tried to work out her problems and control her manic depression, which she did talk about.
Uh-huh.
He did not talk about it. She will mention his black moods. She doesn't usually use the word depression, but he had his own highs and lows. But unlike her, he wouldn't talk about it.
Uh-huh.
And it's always, the longer I work on her, the more it amazes me how people think that she was the vulnerable one, and there was nothing vulnerable in it. One of the reasons that he left that marriage is he was incredibly vulnerable.
Uh-huh.
He had to get out
Tell
because
us about that.
he was feeling smothered.
Hmm.
She here, you know,
By
we get
her,
this whole
she was by her being so capable, or what?
yes,
Hmm.
by her writing, by childcare. They had two children. She wanted more. He wanted less. He would have been he would have been happy with just that one daughter. He
Yeah.
loved the daughter. He had a real hard time. He almost went through what you might call a postpartum depression
Uh-huh.
after his son was born. He even referred to his son at one point as the usurper, because that's one of the things that sometimes happens when when a child is born is obviously the mother's attention is on the child, and the husband, some husbands anyway, go around griping. I
Yep.
used to be the important one.
Yeah.
And so and then he begins to look at other women and find solace in other things. And even though he told her, I want a big country house and a family and so on,
Hmm.
he starts taking the train to London, partly, to work at the BBC. She understands that. But eventually he's thinking, this isn't working for me.
Hmm.
And it's working for her.
Right, because at that point she was someone. I think this is common with women, and especially in that period, but probably today. And actually, even when we talked about Jill Craigie, to want to have your career, but you
Yeah.
also want to have this beautiful home and to entertain and to be a perfect mother and to be beautifully
Yes.
dressed and, to be everything, to do everything.
That's right. She was very much like Joe Craigie.
Mm,
She had a sense of independence, a sense of herself, and at the same time, I don't know how to put this. There are some women who are just superior to men. They just are. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the male listeners. There are just some women who just are dynamite. They have a dynamism to them, a creative quality. Ted was unusual in that he did take care of the children,
hmm.
and gave her time during the day to write and things like that. He was very unusual.
Hmm. Hmm.
With childbirth, especially with the first child, my God, he was there. They had it with a midwife,
Uh-huh.
no doctors.
Hmm.
And he had hypnotized her at one point. He went through relaxation exercises with her. This is in 1960. Men
Yeah.
were not doing this.
Yeah.
This was in England. That's another reason why they were more comfortable in England. She hated hospitals. She didn't want to go in the hospital to have a child.
Yeah. Yeah. So, which I relate to
Yeah. And
completely.
the National Health Service, she thought that was a godsend.
Yep.
Why isn't there a National Health Service in the United
Yeah,
States?
I agree. So I feel a lot of sympathy with her on that, and her, having this, wanting to have this beautiful home in London, and then to have the life in Devon, and then have the life, the intellectual and artistic, circles in London. So she was juggling it more. She was juggling a whole lot, because I remember reading she was making curtains for
Oh,
various
she was
places, stuff like that.
yeah. She
Uh,
painted furniture, she made curtains, she was a
um,
great cook. She was just
Meanwhile,
amazing.
poor Ted, who's obviously being lauded, because I was reading the account of the dinner where the Plaths went to dinner with T.S. Eliot and Stephen Spender and his wife,
Yes,
and Hughes is there as an up and coming poet, one of the
that's
up and
right.
coming favorite poets, and then there's his wife who also writes a bit.
Yeah, I know that, I'm amazed. I'm always amazed that she's not jealous. She's not begrudging. She's always what's wonderful about her is she has her own set of standards,
Hmm.
rather than, why him? You
Hmm.
know, there's never anything like that about it. Even after they broke up, she was not acrimonious, and she was angry,
Hmm.
but she never denied his talent, his genius.
Hmm.
It was like a tragedy that she wasn't enough for him.
Mm-hmm.
That's what really bothered her. How could she not be, think of the way we're describing her. How could she not be enough for him?
Yeah.
But he wanted, at the end, he thought they could reconcile, but his idea of reconciliation was an open marriage,
Mm-hmm.
that she would tolerate these affairs, because there are always women willing to pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
There are always people to say, oh, there's something wrong with Sylvia. I know what to do. I know how I can save Ted if Ted will just,
Mm-hmm.
and Asia Wevel learned the hard way that, she also committed suicide
Yeah.
because she thought that she was what Ted needed. The problem was Ted needed lots of women, not one woman.
Which is just problematic
Yeah.
to, from the point of view of other people. But Sylvia Plath, so she came back to London from Devon and started a life and was doing brilliant, as I understand it, I'm brilliant writing, was getting
Yeah.
herself settled, was
Yes.
starting to kind of feel her way into life as a single woman, single mother, but professionally, on track. I think the Bell Jar was about to be published. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was she died about a month after its publication. So she actually saw some of the first reviews.
Right. And then she killed herself.
Yeah.
I mean, then we'll talk about the aftermath, because what came after that in these last 60 years is quite extraordinary. But I look at it and I think, I mean, that to me is the tragedy.
Mhm.
It looked as though she'd, had tough time, but was sort of,
Overcoming it. Yeah.
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 So why? The
Well, there are
cold?
a
What
number of
else?
factors. Yeah, there are a number of factors here, including the greatest poet. Her greatest poems were written in the last year, 9 months of her life. And the person who understood this better than anybody else, other than Ted Hughes, was L. Alvarez, who
Uh-huh.
I was able to interview. Alvarez thought much sooner than any of the other critics that this was going to be, a great poet. His notion was, on the one hand, these great poems exhilarated her.
Uh-huh.
And she did know. She knew they were great poems.
Uh-huh.
She had no false modesty. She knew
Uh-huh.
she was writing the greatest poetry of her life. She was taking care of her two children. She was getting up at 4 a.m. So there's the physical exhaustion and
Yes.
what these poems are taking out of her. And there's no longer Ted. There's no longer a partner who she can share this with. Sometimes he comes over after they separate, and that's good and that's bad, because
Uh-huh.
partly they renew this partnership and she's reading her new poems to him and he knows they're great. On the other hand, he leaves
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Very
she's
hard.
by herself again. So there's that. There's being in England. She was always a person always was talking about having a salon.
Yes.
She
I remember.
always wanted that connection with the world. And she thought that she could rebuild that kind of salon in London. But there was that harsh, cold winter. Nobody was going anywhere. She was an American, and there was a kind of prejudice amongst her closest friend was married to the writer Ellen Sillitoe, and that friend
Uh-huh.
was an American. She tried to reach out to Stevie Smith. She tried to reach out to Doris Lessing, and those women simply did not engage.
Uh-huh.
She needed women.
Uh-huh.
She needed women around her. That was her idea of a salon. And she didn't have that. So, all right, there's that. There's the breakup with Ted. There's this incredible winter where the pipes freeze and break, and where the British are just not equipped. It's not like Buffalo, where you get out all of the snow removal equipment. There was very little of that in England. She didn't have a home phone. When she
Uh-huh.
moved in December of 62, She applied for a phone. This is what I mean by England still recovering the
Oh,
war.
you had to
She
wait.
couldn't, yeah,
Yeah, you
she
had to
couldn't
wait. Even in the
get,
70s,
she
you had
dies in
to wait.
February,
Yeah.
2 months later, and she still doesn't have a phone. She has to
Yeah.
go out to a call box in the middle of the cold. So, there's this overwhelming, I think, sense of menace.
Mhm.
And I don't know how else to describe this. It's like her marriage too. She knew before she married him, and she knew during the first year of their marriage that there was a problem. But like a lot of marriages that break up, people have this intuition, but they go on. And then suddenly they don't go on. They get a divorce, they separate,
Mhm.
whatever. And then they start to think about earlier events. In other words, they say, what led to this?
Mhm.
So she's thinking about all that too. There are early letters of hers when she first meets him where she essentially describes him as a kind of beast that she's going to tame. And this is just after she's seen that Cocteau movie, Beauty and the Beast, which I write about in my last book, The Making of Sylvia Plath. So she projected certain things into him, and she thought that, as I say, she could tame him. And then it turned out that he was a beast. He couldn't be domesticated.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
that was the problem. And again, when you go back to all the things we said about how she wanted to have all these things, she didn't just want to be a writer. She didn't just want to have children. She wanted the salon. She wanted the
She wanted
husband.
the perfection, a life
Yes.
that was a
Yeah,
model,
yeah,
a
very
perfect
much so. Yeah,
model.
yeah. And she's like Goethe's Werther. I end up talking about Werther, this romantic hero who kills himself over the love of a woman.
Mhm.
I'm not going to say that Plath kills herself over the love of Ted Hughes because that reduces her. It wasn't just Ted Hughes. It wasn't just the break of the marriage. It was this concatenation of events that ultimately gets expressed in the cold. And what I say, particularly in this last book, and also in The Last Days of Sylvia Plath, another one of my Plath books, she was on medication. She was seeing a very good doctor, Dr. Horder, Horder, who himself had suffered from depression. He knew exactly what Sylvia Plath was going through.
Mhm.
And he was just beginning to treat her with one drug called Parnate. Now, one of the side effects of Parnate, that was the brand name. I'm not sure what it would be
Mhm.
called, the generic of it. But the point is, one of the side effects was chills. You would get
Oh,
so can you imagine taking something that's supposed to help you that actually makes you feel worse?
worse.
So there's that. There's the cocktail of drugs. Remember, early 60s, doctors, are just beginning to experiment with things like
Mhm.
Librium. She wasn't
Mhm.
on Librium, but I mean, they were experimenting with drugs, the effects of which they didn't know. Now, here's the final crushing thing. The final crushing thing is that Horder understands she can't do it alone. Well, what do you do in England if you can't do it alone and you don't have this wide circle of friends? She has Gillian Becker, an English
Mhm.
friend, who I also interviewed, who is very understanding
Mhm.
and spent some time with Plath in her final days. But it's not enough. And what Horder says is, we're going to have to institutionalize you at least for a while. You're gonna have to, and to leave her children to go into an institution as she did
Yes, when
uh,
she was young,
when she was young, after
younger.
her,
Yeah.
yeah, she, she did try to commit suicide once before, and I would say she recovered,
Her
but
so her doctor in England wanted to section her is
yeah, yeah,
wow.
and
I didn't know that.
it was an extreme measure. And she had read this book called The Ha Ha, which is about an English woman who's institutionalized and what that does to her. The book does have a kind of happy outcome, but
Mhm.
she identified, I think, with that heroine and what she would have to go through. Your life is not your own, obviously, when you go
Mm.
into an institution. And to someone like Plath, the only way that she survived, I don't think she would have survived the first institutionalization at McLean Hospital, except for Ruth Boysher. Ruth Barnhouse is her maiden name. Her papers are at Smith. She bonded with that therapist
Mm-hmm.
in a way that she couldn't with men. She just couldn't. Several men
Mm-hmm.
had tried to treat her, and it just didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked with Ruth Barnhouse, and they kept up a lifelong
Mm-hmm.
correspondence for as long as
Mm-hmm.
Plath lived. But Barnhouse was in Massachusetts, and
Mm-hmm.
Plath was in England, and you know it so
So,
it's this whole complex. So that it could have been different. It
so
could have
it
been.
wasn't just to, you see, well, I find myself wondering because she's well known now and acknowledged as a great poet. If she had known then how much acclaimed she would be, how successful she could be, would that have made a difference?
Possibly. Yeah, possibly it might have made a difference because along with that great success would have come the salon.
Yes.
She would have been great having a
The
salon.
connections,
The
the
connections
the
with other
human
women.
warmth
Yeah,
that she needed. That
yeah.
she
I
needed.
think the warmth would have been there.
Yeah.
So we can't know for sure, but I think so.
But that's what, when I think about her dying at 30, I just think, I mean, what a loss, not
Yeah, yeah.
world, but
What
to
I try
her,
to
the loss of
yeah,
what could have been a marvelous,
yeah.
life.
That's why I try, though, to push back at this idea, this sort of essentialist idea that, oh, she was bound to die, bound to commit suicide. When you see the whole complex of factors, when you take into account what I think a biographer should
Uh-huh.
take into account, contingency, the way certain things happen at
Uh-huh.
certain
Yes.
times,
Yes.
it makes all the difference in the world.
What makes her so uh, interesting? I mean, she became obviously notorious because the suicide and then the publications, but of continuing interest and to feminists, the defacing of her gravestone is one of the
Yeah.
first things I ever heard about with Sylvia Plath. But then a continuing interest both in the poetry and in the life. Why?
I think part is the fact that we keep learning new things.
Mm-hmm.
That
How can
when
that be? Did
my
you
first
do explain why? Why
my
are there new
first
things?
My first Plath biography came out in 2013, 50th anniversary of her death. And one of the reasons was not just because it was the anniversary of her death, but because both the Alvarez and Owen Hughes archives were suddenly open at the British Library. Owen Hughes being Ted Hughes' sister, who became the executor of the Plath Hughes
Because we
estate
should say that Sylvia Plath died without making
without a
any other
will.
plans for her copyright for her
That's right.
property. So they went to her estranged husband.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. What she would have done if she had lived longer, she definitely was deciding on a divorce, but we just don't know. Anyway, he got to control everything. And because Ted Hughes got to control everything, there's a lot we didn't know. And he was a terrible conservator of her papers. He lost things. He destroyed at least one journal. He he turned out collections of her work, like her collected poems, which he divided into two sections, the mature work and what he considered the mature work, which happened to be all the work after he met her, and the juvenilia, which is a separate section. But even then, he doesn't include everything that should be in there.
Uh,
For instance, there's a poem, Mad Girl's Love Song, which is a
mhm.
wonderful villanelle. It's not in her collected poems. It's crazy. I've just written a book about her understanding of the Stoics and how important Stoicism is to her. And I just discovered she wrote a poem in 1949 called The Stoic. There are close to 40 references to to Stoics and Stoicism in her letters and journals. that no one has ever written about,
Uh-huh.
that I've just written an essay about for that reason. So we constantly, you would think, yes, after all these years and all those books and all that stuff, right now, two women are working on a new edition of her collected poetry, which has to occur, you know, because Ted Hughes didn't do her any good by the way he edited her work. The collected prose just came out, edited by Peter Steinberg, and even that, it's collected. And this is not a knock on Peter Steinberg, but she wrote really interesting papers at Cambridge about Plato,
Uh-huh.
and the classical dramatists, and about Christianity. Some of this I deal with in my last book, The Making of Sylvia Plath. And you can't even get access to that. It's at the Lilly Library, but you have to write to Faber and Faber. Unless
Oh,
you go to the
well,
Lilly
then
Library, you have to write to Faber and Faber
we know
to
what
get
that
permission
means.
to get a copy of those things. So that's why, you know, it's like this time release capsule
I see.
of material.
So her estate, her literary estate, ended up with her estranged husband, and then was sort of run to some extent by his sister, who, by all accounts, was quite a character herself.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
She
and
said, somebody asked her about my book. She said, all lies.
so, so I, and I, of course, I always wonder if Sylvia Plath, if she even had, if it occurred to her that she, people often don't, right? People often don't think about things like that. Their literary estate, they don't think, well, what actually is going to happen in a practical way if I die? But anyway, that is a very awkward situation, obviously, to have your work with an estranged spouse, where some of it is critical of that spouse, or just uncomfortable in various ways. So, so I see, and it's sort of straggled out over the years. Meanwhile, her reputation as a poet has continued to be strong. And what about her as a figure, in terms of how women see her as is her life emblematic of some, of her era, or is it some, the struggle of the artist to find her way? Is this, something that I puzzle over, her continued the continued interest by it's well, I was reading a Guardian article. It was asking a bunch of women writers about, their and they all, like, as teenagers, they, you know, fell in love with Sylvia Plath's work and story.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's obviously that of the young woman's identification with her, and she's going through the problems that many young people go through, male and female, but
Uh-huh.
certainly with female readers. But what I try to do, especially in this last book, The Making of Sylvia Plath, is to show that she's sometimes called a confessional poet. And that's a great distortion. It's not that she isn't dealing with her own experience.
Uh-huh.
But for instance, she's cooking. She's in her kitchen and she cuts her finger very badly. She almost chops off the tip of her thumb. And she writes a poem called Cut. And she's looking at this bleeding finger and the blood gushing out. And she starts talking about redcoats. And then she puts on a bandage and she starts talking about the Ku Klux Klan. And it becomes a poem about not a person, but a poem that's, in a sense, dedicated to history, to bloodletting, and the tragic occurrences.
Hmm.
And she thinks of this with a historical dimension that gives me chills.
Uh-huh.
She writes about it the same way that Constantine Kafafi does in Alexandria when he relates the story of Antony and Cleopatra or anything else. It becomes domestic. It
Uh-huh.
becomes the story of two people as well as the story of history. And she has got this dimension that's very much like poets who deal with history, like Cavafy,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
like Zbigniew Herbert, like Sheila, an Irish poet who I love, Sheila Wingfield. They all have that in common. And that's what makes her stand out. And the people who don't really know Sylvia Plath and think that she's just, well, like Marilyn Monroe, that's because she died when she was young and she was a suicide. Well, that's certainly part of it, but it's a very superficial part. You don't last for 50 or
Uh-huh.
60 years now just because you committed suicide or because young girls are interested in you.
Uh-huh.
You don't become a part of the university curriculum for those reasons.
Uh-huh.
There might be some stupid professors who might say that, but in general, you just look and you can see that's not true. There's a new book on Plath, telling her life by examining, I think it's 6 of her poems. I don't remember the title of it, but I'm going to get a hold of it and probably review it. So it continues, and it's because there are repercussions. There are delayed reactions to what Plath actually stands for, and the culture has shifted. So people, I think, what makes her great, and it's true of all great writers, is that they continue to remain relevant because new generations find things that those earlier generations, their own contemporaries, did not see. I mean, they didn't see
So,
in Marilyn Monroe, her
uh-huh.
contemporaries could not have imagined that we would be still talking about her. You know, to most people in the 50s, Marilyn Monroe was just, the blonde bombshell, and that's the end of it, and no one's going to care 20 or 30 years later. Well, they do care. And one of the people that knew this while Marilyn Monroe was alive was Sylvia Plath, because Plath has a wonderful dream about Marilyn Monroe, who comes to her and does her nails and sort of does therapy, talks about how everything's going to be okay. And Plath is attuned to what makes this woman remarkable.
So part of what you've been doing is trying to get people to help us focus on more of the substance. It seems like you're saying that we've been distracted by the drama, obviously.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah. The drama's there. The drama's important.
Mhm.
She was all the things people say about
Uh-huh.
her. She could be very self-absorbed. She could obviously could be depressive and suicidal, but to reduce her to that is just, it doesn't make any sense. No one would last
Uh-huh.
who is just a pathetic suicide.
Yeah.
Just that can't be all there is.
Yeah.
Marilyn Monroe is my first biographical subject, and for the same reason. There's a
Uh-huh.
body of work there.
Well, you've done something for me because I must admit that I was interested in Sylvia Plath when I was young, and then I was over that. But
Yes.
you have renewed my interest in her work. So that's terrific. Thank you so much. Really.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter, at karenchristensen.substack.com.